No story of York County's role in the Underground Railroad would be totally complete without also involving Lancaster County. We were completely connected, completely tied in this whole thing because all the York County conductors in the Underground Railroad needed to send these runaway slaves to safety someplace else. And the greatest place, a place that had a ton of helpers, was Lancaster County. Yeah, sometimes maybe we sent some of the different runaway slaves up to Harrisburg. There were some helpers in Harrisburg, but Lancaster was extremely helpful to our conductors in the Underground Railroad and to those freedom seekers that were trying to find freedom and get further down the way on the Underground Railroad and eventually make their way to Philadelphia, New York City, and then hopefully the entire way to Canada. Now, our overall goal here, objective, is to determine the role that York and Lancaster counties played in assisting runaway slaves to their freedom on the Underground Railroad. What you see here with the map on the right, this is an Underground Railroad map, but I want you to notice specifically this area right here. This is one of the main pathways on the Underground Railroad. And you notice, here we are. Here's York County. So one of the main passageways in the Underground Railroad ran straight through York and straight through Lancaster. Even Harriet Tubman, as mentioned previously, Harriet Tubman had made 2 passages through York. She went back down to Maryland 19 times to try to free slaves, and she herself would guide them to freedom. But 2 of the times she actually went through York. But great story there. But York County was pretty huge on the Underground Railroad. But as big as we were, Lancaster was probably even bigger. Now, again, York and Lancaster completely partners in the Underground Railroad. Someone like William Goodrich or any of the helpers in the Underground Railroad would usually have some way to message, some way to contact people like Thaddeus Stevens or his spouse, Lydia Hamilton Smith, and eventually transfer that runaway and continue them further to the east until they could get to Philadelphia. So we would completely communicate with the people within Lancaster and try to do what we could to get that person to the next place, the next stop, and maintain safety. Now, I want to go back and mention this guy because you saw him within your game yesterday, but I can't say enough about the guy. This guy was born a slave, eventually got his freedom at age 18, started a barbershop, eventually opened a variety store, purchased his own hotel, bought his own railroad cars, and then he would use all this stuff to help runaway slaves in York. So he did everything he could, despite the fact that he was an extremely reputable and well known business person. He would use every one of his facilities to try to house and hide and keep safe runaway slaves. And then he would also use those railroad cars to hide them in a railroad car, get them towards Philadelphia, or at least get them to Lancaster and get them to the next step to freedoms, next step to safety. But William Goodrich, he's the guy to know if you were a runaway slave back in the 1840s and 50s and you needed somebody to help you. He's the best person to help you gain freedom. His house has actually been opened up as a museum at 124 East Philadelphia Street, especially on First Fridays. Once this whole coronavirus stuff is done, on First Fridays, they open up his house and you can go see. And a lot of times they actually have a reenactor that will reenact the role of William Goodrich. But just a beautiful story of a great person that achieved a lot and also dedicated himself to people that truly needed it. Now on to the Lancaster helpers. First goal was to get to Lancaster, and we know already that crossing the Susquehanna River was a challenge. It was a huge challenge. But luckily, in Marietta, just across the way from Wrightsville, were William Whipper and Stephen Smith. They owned a lumber company, and they were constantly moving ships, constantly moving wood across the Susquehanna River. And they do this at all hours of the day and night. So if they could move that stuff, why couldn't they move people? And so these gentlemen would move runaway slaves, would pick up somebody around Wrightsville and take them across the river to Marietta, and then move them further on their path. William Whipper would actually house them in his house, and he would spend basically all of his life savings trying to help runaways. He estimated he spent about $1,000 each year helping runaways. And if you actually look at that in today's money, it's more like $16,000 in today's money. And he would help anywhere from 1 to 17 different runaways in a single night. And then eventually he would get these runaway slaves in a train car, and send them towards Philadelphia and get them to other people that would help them and give them safety. That's your first stop here. If you're a runaway slave within the Lancaster area, you'd probably meet Stephen Smith or William Whipper. Then your next stop, if you did not get on a train and go the entire way to Philadelphia in basically one fell swoop, would be to go see Thaddeus Stevens or go to the AME Zion Church. Thaddeus Stevens, it is amazing to me that this guy decided to be an Underground Railroad helper. I know that he was a huge abolitionist, but altogether, this guy served in the United States House of Representatives. He was an extremely prominent congressperson, extraordinarily well known within the country. He was also a well known lawyer within Lancaster as well, but he felt so passionate for the cause of anti slavery that he decided to open up his house and his law firm to house and keep runaway slaves and then to help them eventually make it to Philadelphia. But an extremely influential and well known person, somebody that was basically a fan of Abraham Lincoln, despite the fact that they had their problems sometimes, but a hugely influential person in the country, but yet he put himself at risk. He could have been easily jailed and put in jail for 2 years, and he would have lost all of his standing in our country if he would have been found out as being a conductor in the Underground Railroad. His spouse, I'll say his spouse, was his housekeeper, and she's depicted right here in this, and this is supposed to be Thaddeus Stevens here by two reenactors. But anyway, his housekeeper for 20 years eventually basically became his wife, and that is Lydia Hamilton Smith. And Lydia Hamilton Smith, when Thaddeus Stevens had to go to Washington, D.C., Lydia was the one that was opening up the house for these runaway slaves. And she had another trick in her sleeve, too, and that was she would pay different spies to keep an eye on the bounty hunters or the slave catchers, to always make sure that she was one step ahead of them so that she and Thaddeus Stevens would never get caught for trying to help these runaway slaves. Now, let's go to the AME Zion Church, the Bethel AME Zion Church. This church and these churches were in York, Lancaster, Philadelphia, Boston, New York City, and they were heavily dedicated to hiding and maintaining the safety of these runaway slaves. They would hide the slaves in the church, they would hide the slaves in the reverend's house, they'd hide the slaves in the homes of congregants, but they're trying to keep these runaways as safe as possible and try to help get them to Philadelphia, to New York City, and eventually to Canada. Some of these runaway slaves could just go through AME Zion Church to AME Zion Church from one to the next to the next to the next and just make their way in the Underground Railroad, just getting help from this church and the church's congregants. Your next one here, your next choice. Are you going to stay in Lancaster, in Christiana, or are you going to try to go towards Philadelphia and eventually make it the whole way to Canada? Now, Christiana was a location that was dedicated to the safety of these runaway slaves. And there was a gentleman by the name of William Parker, who himself had been a runaway, that decided he's going to make a town that's going to be dedicated to these runaway slaves. And these former slaves are going to defend one another with their lives if anyone ever threatens them. And so here's where a kind of crazy story comes in. So William Parker, there's no picture on this guy, but William Parker comes to eastern Lancaster County, to this area right here, comes to eastern Lancaster County, and decides to create his own settlement, his own town. And he's welcoming any runaway slave to join him. All they got to promise is that if somebody tries to come catch him, we're defending each other with our lives. So he moves into this area, and all of a sudden you have tons and tons of different free black people as well as runaway slaves that started settling in the area of Christiana. And they would dedicate to defending one another, no matter what it took. And Edward Gorsuch was a Maryland slave owner, a tavern owner in Maryland, who had 4 runaway slaves that came up to Christiana in 1851. He decided to come get his runaway slaves. He got a tip-off from somebody that was going through Pennsylvania and came to his tavern and said, I know exactly where these 4 runaways are. So he decides that he's going to get on his horse, he's going to bring 2 of his sons, he's going to go get a sheriff, and he's going to go to this Parker house in Christiana and Lancaster County and go get his four runaways back. When he arrives at the Parker house, Parker answers the door, but Parker's wife goes up to a second-story window and blows a horn. And all of a sudden, they say as many as 100 of the townspeople start coming towards the Parker house and surrounding the house. Gorsuch got angry and he started threatening Parker. And eventually, he started lunging towards him. And somebody started throwing in items at Parker or at Gorsuch. Next thing you know, shots rang out. Things were being tossed at him. He was getting beaten, and Gorsuch fell lifeless. But this Maryland slave owner was dead on the ground. His son was beaten up pretty bad. The sheriff took off, and altogether, no one was at that time apprehended. They didn't know who caused this. They didn't know who killed Gorsuch or beat up his sons. But what they knew is here's a Maryland slave owner, a fairly powerful person in the state of Maryland that is now dead. So what are we going to do about it? In the end, they had a court case, and 38 people were arrested and charged with murder. But in the end, no one was convicted. No one went to jail. And the South felt entirely cheated in this situation. They thought their rights were being completely violated. And this is just one episode in many where the South felt violated and angry at the North for not, in their mind, upholding their rights. But it's kind of crazy to think that an event that happened in a place called Christiana, and I'll tell you too, Christiana is located just down the street from the Strasburg Railroad, just to the east of the Strasburg Railroad, as well as if you've ever been to Dutch Wonderland or the Lancaster Outlets, it's about 15 minutes away from those locations to the southeast. And a little place like that has a rich history and an event that helped to cause our Civil War, helped our nation to break a little bit further. Now, altogether, if a runaway chose to continue their journey towards Canada, they'd have to go from Lancaster to Philadelphia. William Whipper, Thaddeus Stevens, or William Goodrich might help them with transportation on a train to Philly, or they might just move them along to other helpers as they continue their way to Philadelphia. From there, they're going to try to head up north towards New York City and then probably make it the entire way to Canada. They might stop someplace before that, but the only true safety was in Canada. To finish this lesson, make sure to play the quizzes game that's going to take a look at both the roles of York and Lancaster on the Underground Railroad. All right, have a nice day.